What I'd like to do today is come back to the question of how everyday life, nothing special, just everyday life, not any special type of everyday life, can free us from our neurotic pain. Now, this is a question that I'm tempted to say you won't find written about in any of the therapy books or any of the self-help books. I'm tempted to throw that in as a type of a hook, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe you will find it written somewhere. I never have, but you might, possibly. But anyway, the question is that if we understand that we can't be helped by our own efforts, by our own interference with ourselves, which is the way of error, then that understanding is the same understanding as the understanding that we can be freed from outside of ourselves, which means not our own efforts. This doesn't mean someone else, another human being, doing some kind of stuff, doing some kind of therapy stuff. It doesn't refer to other human beings because they're the same as we are, obviously enough. It refers to life itself. Now, this is a tricky subject because we're more than likely to say, well, it was life itself that got me into this mess. So why would life get me out? But the thing is, it's always ourselves that get ourselves into messes. The mess is always of our own doing, even if we can't do it, see it. And of course, very often we can't see it. But nevertheless, it's a good little thing to remember that the mess is always of our own doing. Now, this doesn't mean that everything's our fault, which it very nearly seems to be the same thing as saying lots of bad things can happen to us that aren't our fault. And this very often happens. So that isn't the mess. It is a mess, but it's the mess on the outside. That's a situation that's just happened to us, and very painful and rotten situations can happen and often do happen. But the mess is our reaction to it. So the situation can come and then go, and I can be left still suffering from it for a long time. So there's still a mess. And that isn't our fault either. In fact, no matter what we say, it's never a question that it's our fault. The very notion of fault is a frank and utter absurdity. There are no faults. And actually, if we can see that there is no fault, no matter what my situation, then this in itself is a great liberation. Because we oppress ourselves constantly with the thought that it's my fault, whether this is conscious or not conscious, or I should have done something about it. I should do something about it. I shouldn't have let it happen. I've let it go on too long. And the reason this type of thinking is an error is because we're overvaluing our own volition. We're overvaluing our own free will. If it could happen that we could see ourselves very clearly, just imagine that we could set off some flashbulb some magnesium flare that would reveal things as they are. And they're not usually, they're hardly ever revealed as they are. We don't see things as they are. But if we could, what we'd see is that we move along automatically and things happen to us. And even when we think we're making choices, those choices are conditioned by the stuff that happened before us. So it's not really a choice at all. In order to make a choice, we'd have to be conscious. And even though we all think we're conscious, what this flashbulb, hypothetical flashbulb, would show is that we're not conscious. And so when we are not conscious, we can't make decisions. We can't choose things any more than a sleepwalker can choose things or make decisions. It all just happens, as Gojo says. That kind of sums up everything, really. Everything to do with mechanical life. It's just a thing that just happens. The toy is wound up and it does this and does that and goes from here to there, and then it unwinds and it stops, and that's it. And that is what mechanical life is. And mechanical life has one key thing that it does. It gets us into very tricky situations. It gets us into a mess because it's blind, and it functions on a very, very simple motivation, which is to avoid pain and seek pleasure. And that motivation is the perfect motivation for getting us into a mess. It always will get us into a mess. It'll never fail. It's absolutely infallible. So then the next thing is, here we are in a mess. How does life get us out of it? How can life possibly get us out of it? Because up to this point we've been labouring under the misapprehension that if we are to get out of it, we have to do it ourselves. But we can't do that because we're running blind. We don't really know what better is. So how can we don't know what to be improved is, so how can we improve ourselves? All our ideas of what it means to be better or improved are they're false ideas created by the thinking mind. Our idea of what mental health is a false idea. So mental health comes from a direction we can never see it, that we can never see, and it is something that we have no conception of or never can anticipate. We really don't know what it is. What it is the freedom we've lost without knowing that we've lost it. So when we look for mental health, or when we try to increase our mental health, we look for it on the basis of the position that we're in, which is the position of having lost freedom without knowing it. So that position is not a position that's ever going to allow us to find mental health. What mental health is, as I just said, is the freedom that we lost without knowing it. So how can we go looking for it? Because we don't even know that we lost it. But just because we ourselves cannot untangle ourselves or navigate our way out of it, that doesn't mean that there isn't a way out. It's just a way out that we're not in charge of and we don't know about. So the real crux of the matter can be found in pain or discomfort or fear. And it is when we are experiencing pain or discomfort or fear that we have the opportunity of being freed, which is opposite to our normal conception, because we want to be free at such times, but we see our freedoms lying in the cessation of the pain or discomfort or fear. So freedom for us means that the pain goes away, obviously, the discomfort goes away, the uncomfortableness, all of the stuff we don't like goes away. So here's the dilemma in a nutshell, is that we see freedom one way when actually the freedom is in the fear, in the discomfort, in the pain, which is a pretty hard idea to sell. And I reckon that you couldn't really sell it. You could never make a living selling that idea, really. But anyway, to continue with this explanation of how we are freed, not by ourselves, but by the process of life itself, which is, you could say, smarter than we are, which wouldn't be hard. What happens when we're in pain, normally, and I'm primarily talking about emotional or mental pain, of course, is that we generate a whole lot of thinking about the pain. And more than this, we generate a kind of an outlook, a perspective, an orientation in relation to this pain. So what that means is that all of our attention and energy goes in the direction of looking at how we might be free from the pain. So we're very, very orientated to whatever might constitute an escape from the pain. We're escape orientated, which is pretty undeniable. And if you don't believe it, just wait till the next time you're in emotional or mental pain. You'll see it happening straight away. Now, the problem with that is that the escape is it's a mental projection. It's a wishing, and it's not a reality. So by giving all our attention to a wish or a projection, technically speaking, we become unconscious. We become a mechanism. If we were to give all our attention to the reality of what's happening, then we wouldn't be unconscious. So even though I just said we put all of our attention on escaping, that's one manifestation of our orientation. The other manifestation would be, this shouldn't be happening. This isn't good that it's happening. So even if I don't have a belief in an escape or a desperate hope in an escape, I'm still doing this same orientation, only it's to do with, this shouldn't be happening, this is a bad thing to be happening, how did this happen, etc., etc., etc. All those types of thoughts. I could also be blaming myself for it happening, or writing myself off, saying there's something wrong with me. But here again, it makes no difference if we do this either. This is the same thing. We're blaming ourselves, or saying that, blaming the situation. We're still putting all our attention on something which is a fantasy. And the fantasy is this notion that this shouldn't happen, or is wrong to happen, or is a very bad thing to happen. All of these are just things that arise from the activity of the thinking mind. It likes to label, so it labels it as bad. What does it mean when the thinking mind or evaluative mind labels my situation as bad? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean feck all. The thinking mind can evaluate whatever it wants in whatever way it wants, but it doesn't make a darn bit of difference. It's a completely empty performance. It means nothing. So if we can see this clearly, if we can see the hollowness of the mind's characteristic attitude and activities, then that's the same thing as saying we're getting disillusioned from it. And if we get a disillusion from it, we stop giving it all our attention. We can see the notions of escape as being illusory notions, and we can see all this talk about it shouldn't happen being another illusion. So when we see illusion for illusion, we no longer fixate on it, because we realize there's no longer any meat in it. We see the phantom for being a phantom. So then our attention is back in the present moment. So we're seeing ourselves in pain, and we're experiencing what it's like to be in pain without having any thoughts about it. And this turns out to be a much cleaner experience than the struggling type experience we normally have. It's clearer and it's cleaner, and there's actually something happening when we do this. What's happening when we do this is that we're not only are we disidentifying with the activities of thought, we're disidentifying with that construct of thought called the self. So instead of looking at the world through the self, via the self, from the self's viewpoint, we're looking at things from the consciousness that was formatted into believing itself to be a self. So looking at things, I can't really say the point of view of consciousness, because it's not a point, it's more of a field, it's a space. So looking at things from this space, which is consciousness, is very, very different from looking at it from the POV of the self. The self is a frantic little thing, and it has no ability to bear discomfort. All it can do is frantically look for ways out, or ways of defeating or combating or overcoming the discomfort, the source of the discomfort. And that's all the talk we hear in mental health circles, all that type of military language. All that language comes from the POV of the self. And the reason the self has to talk like that is because that's all it can do. It's either an escape artist or a aggression artist. It doesn't have the ability to just be in difficulty. And the reason it doesn't is precisely because it's a construct. Constructs don't have any inner strength. They don't have any ability to access reserves of patience and strength and wisdom. When we're identified with a self-construct, we're cut off from all those things, and that's a pretty awful situation. And usually when we're in pain, we identify all the more with the self. And we think, oh, this self is suffering, oh, this is terrible. All these thoughts from the point of view of the self, which cuts us off even more from the resources that are there. But on the other hand, when we're observing what's going on via consciousness, which has not been formatted into a illusory construct called the self, we discover that we have vast resources, because consciousness is not threatened by what's going on, whereas the self was. And the self always is being threatened. It's an inherently threatened situation, an inherently insecure situation. Because it's not real. I mean, there's no more insecure position than that. It's not real, and it doesn't have any resources. So how threatened is that? It's not a great way to be facing the difficulties that life throws at us, or whatever life throws at us or brings our way. So when we see through the self's activities and its characteristic ways of trying to escape pain, which makes pain worse, and it just naturally happens that we stop giving it all our attention, we stop feeding it. And then at that point, our attention is back in the present moment of what is going on, and we are seeing things via consciousness. And not only does this mean that we are much more able to be in the difficult situation, it also means that we are not perpetuating and exacerbating that difficult situation. Because not to forget, that situation came about because of our identification with the mind-created self. So we might think the mind-created self is great, and we don't want to give up on it. And we do think this, not consciously, but on a very deep level, we take this as read. We don't want to give this up because it's too precious a thing. And yet it actually turns out to be a very crappy way of living life. There's nothing good about it at all. And the only reason we're so averse to anything else is because it is in the nature of consciousness, when it is formatted into the self, to fear anything different, to not trust anything different. So we cling on to the misery we know, and we might even tell ourselves that it isn't misery. So in other words, we're clinging on to this little knot of consciousness, this little knot of tension, because we can't conceive what will happen to us if we don't. And the point about that is we don't need to conceive it. If we conceive it, that just means, if we can conceive it, it just means more of the same. It means more of the same of the self-conditioned reality tunnel, which is all the same and it's all equally crap. And that might seem like a kind of strange thing to say, but all it is the self relating to its own projections, and the self doesn't in any ultimate way exist. So how can the self, which doesn't exist, relating solely and exclusively on a constant basis to its own projections, be anything other than crap? So our problem is we're always looking for freedom on the basis of the self, escape for the self. We never think of escape from the self, from the very limiting modality of being in the world that is the mind-created idea of ourselves. And all of this is summarized by the little Buddhist saying, which is, no self, no problem. Okay, thanks for watching.